Hi, everyone. I'm going to get started. Can everyone hear? Everyone can hear me. Hi, Courtney. Thank you so much for coming. This is the first kickoff event, the keynote event of the II 30th Anniversary Symposium. I'm really glad to see everyone in the audience. We also have members listening on Zoom. And we'll have a great discussion after Mike's lecture. So I'm going to get us started. Our speaker today, David Michael Lampton, is Professor Emeritus of Chinese Studies at Johns Hopkins University and former Hyman Professor and Director of SAIS China and China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and Senior Research Fellow at the Foreign Policy Institute. He also served as the Dean of Faculty at SAIS from 2004 to 2012. He was president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations from 1988 to 1997, and he's now a board member of the National Committee and a member of the Executive Committee. He's the author of many books that I will not mention here, but most importantly, the book that he will touch upon today, co-authored with Selena Ho and Chung-Chi Kwik, Rivers of Iron, Railroads, and Chinese Power in Southeast Asia, which was published by University of California Press in 2020, which examines the People's Republic of China high-speed rail construction in 8 Southeast Asian states. He's also published widely in academic and popular journals, from Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy to the American Political Science Review, the China Quarterly, and the New York Times. Any scholar of Chinese domestic politics will immediately recognize Dr. Lampton's contribution to our understanding of Chinese politics, not only from these many recently published books and articles, but also, for me anyway, going to grad school in the 1990s, for its edited volume with Ken Lieberthal, who's also here today, Bureaucracy, Politics, Decision-Making in Post-Mao China, which sounds maybe boring to some of you, but was actually a major book in the way in which we thought about China theoretically and conceptually, but also a new model for doing field work in bureaucracies and authoritarian regimes, which is now a really important part of the field. Dr. Lampton received his BA, MA, and PhD degrees from Stanford University, but he was a postdoc fellow at the University of Michigan Center for Chinese Studies in 1974-1975, after which he went somewhere else. So thank you, Mike, and this podium is yours.
Well, it's good to be back in Ann Arbor. I think I was back about 15 years ago, but my wife and I moved here for a great year 50 years ago, almost exactly to this month. So my wife Susan, who's here with me, we're just really on many levels glad to be back in Ann Arbor. I want to thank Mary for her kind introduction. And acknowledge the 30th anniversary of the International Institute, only raising the issue that at the time I came here, there wasn't an International Institute, but there was a Center for Chinese Studies founded in 1961 that was really, I would say, what I'd almost call the mother lode of contemporary China studies in the United States in that era. The International Institute, of course, has now embodied that China Studies Center as part of the overall structure. And of course, Michigan plays such an enormous role in a number of area studies centers, national resource centers, and so forth. My good colleague and friend and co-author of the book, Mary, was kind enough to mention Ken Lieberthal. Of course, it's the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies. So I want to acknowledge that. As I said, 50 years ago, my wife Susan and I packed up our VW microbus. It was the green and cream-colored model. We put our racing bikes on the front and started out from California across the bug or the van barely made it across the Continental Divide, blew an engine in Joliet, Illinois, as I recall, and we sort of limped to Ann Arbor thereafter. It was a great trip and a great opportunity to come to a new place and make great friends, which I've had throughout my professional life. As I said, and I just want to, for some particularly younger people here, may not be fully acquainted with the history of China studies at the University of Michigan, and I'm not going to give a lecture, but I started writing down the names of people who were here. I was just a young postdoc here, and persons who played a role in my professional career much later, but also were the guts of my graduate school syllabus when I was at Stanford. And those names include Michael Oxenberg, and Alex Eckstein, Al Feuerwerker, Rhodes Murphy, Dick Solomon, Bob Dernberger, Don Monroe, Myron Wegman over in public health, who helped me write turn my dissertation into a book on the politics of medicine, Ernie and Marilyn Young, and I'm sure I've left out many. But the point is, no matter what your interest was, this was the place to be if you were interested in contemporary China. I also have to say that Michigan was never happy just leading the intellectual pack. People in Michigan played an enormous role in public education and outreach. Not only that, played an enormous role in advising our government moving from the containment era and the Cold War towards a different vision of our relationship with China. I thought that Michigan Department of Political Science had a lock on the National Security Council senior position on China. It certainly had Dick Solomon was there. Ken Lieberthal, and of course Mike Oxenberg, who was a friend particularly to Ken and me. So this was a multifaceted institution that had an enormous impact in how the public thought about China, how government acted, and of how young scholars like me came into the field. So I didn't even hesitate when Mary Gallagher asked me to come and talk on this occasion, because it means so much to my career and to our field, and I think the United States. So you all ought to be proud to be affiliated with an institution like this. Now, I've been asked today to talk about China's global ambitions and getting assessments balanced. And so the two balance words are China's ambitions, which it certainly has, although we can't just assume there's one view in China. And I think it's particularly important at this moment to get our assessments balanced. I think what I have to say here, although it's aimed at China, will be relevant to almost every other discussion I see listed on the syllabus, particularly for tomorrow's program. So I hope even those of you who are not particularly focused on China will find comparative value in what I have to say. Now, this is an awkward time to try to have a balanced assessment of China. And there are really two parts to my talk that might seem in uneasy conjunction to each other, but I think, in fact, what I have to say is precisely about that conjunction. This is a moment of where security issues are dominating our discussion, and I'll talk about that. But on the other hand, this is also a period in which China is doing much in the world. And one of the things that I've been studying is its building of infrastructure under the broad rubric of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I want to look at some of the ways in which China's having influence, how we might think about its power, and most importantly, in the context of the security discussion, what are the limitations on Chinese power. I think we're pretty well impressed with capacities, but what are the limitations? And I want to look at that railroad building effort through the lens of what are some of the limitations, achievements, as well as now, the first thing to say, I think, about our current era and the security focus is that for the last 35, 40 years, we've basically, we, the United States, through at least 8 presidents, had what I would call basically a policy of reassuring China. And conversely, China tried to reassure us as it became stronger that it would use its power and influence in ways compatible with our basic interests. Well, quite frankly, the current era, we've moved away from that, and we're in an era of deterrence. And the defining characteristic of deterrence is threat. So each of us is trying to find a set of a dial up on the threats that will deter the other from doing what it is we fear. So the very fundamental strategy or toolbox we're using has moved from reassurance to deterrence. And by we, I mean China and the United States. Also, second thing I would say about the current era, there's, of course, been a debate about whether this is a second Cold War or are we headed towards a second Cold War. I don't want to get too hung up on that debate because, of course, we can see the great economic interdependence, investment even here in Michigan from China. We can see lots of things that we never had with the Soviet Union. So I'm not arguing for identity. But I think at the current time we have to recognize how many similarities there are to the Cold War era. And let me just tick off a few of those things. First of all, we're in an action-reaction cycle. In that sense, in the area of weapons, technology is providing more and more ways in which we each can threaten the other, and we're each trying to stay ahead in the development of technologies. And of course, the other side is reacting, and then each side reacts, and you have a stair step of escalation up. So we are in an arms race with China. I don't see how you can sugarcoat that. I don't welcome that. I think it's dangerous, but in fact, it seems to me we are there. Secondly, we're into competitive alliance formation, and I'm sure tomorrow we'll hear plenty of discussion of that. But we're building both new international organizations to corral as many countries into aligning with us as we can. Also, we're mobilizing NATO to a limited extent. Certainly, we have the 5 security treaties that the United States has bilaterally in Asia and so forth. So we're trying to strengthen alliances, and you can see that we just recently had a meeting of the South Korean, Japanese, and American presidents and heads of state. So you can see alliance formation. Ideological. I mean, just put it out there. President Biden has defined the current era as the struggle between autocracy and democracy. Agree or don't agree, but that's a pretty ideological definition of the era that we're in. Talk about big power alignment. Nixon went to China to divide China and the Soviet Union. Now our policies, in some sense, are driving Russia and China together. There are many. Another similarity is that countries, when the big powers become more polarized, feel obliged to, in some sense, choose between those powers or find a way to stay, to avoid the necessity to choose. So you have middle powers searching for their role in this increasing competition. In short, you don't need to get hung up on whether it's a Cold War or not, but all the major issues in the relationship are being securitized. I was just reading over coffee yesterday's, I think it was the New York Times, had an article on a planned battery factory here in Michigan, and it's become an item of controversy on multiple dimensions. So the long and the short of it is we're in a very different era, one in which security issues are driving everything else, and increasing numbers of educational, research, diplomacy issues are all being filtered through the lens of security. So how many Chinese students to have in what kind of labs on university campuses, for instance? What what considerations of security need we apply to graduate students so when they go to China, they're safe, whatever we mean by that. These are all real issues. So there's a big security component to all of this. I would just end by saying, and I think everybody who knows me knows I'm an optimist, and I am an optimist, but I would say that we have not seen the bottom of this relationship, I'm afraid to say. I firmly hope that I'm wrong about that. And I would have to say you've got to take seriously the possibility of kinetic conflict between China and the United States. So that seems to me to be kind of for this era, a normal statement of that's, in my mind, what the problem is. And we then, of course, have a lot of issues about how we assess Chinese power, what Chinese intentions are to use this power. And I thought with all of this sort of negativity, emphasis on securitization and so on, what I would do is, for a few minutes, try to introduce a project I ran with two colleagues, which Mary was kind enough to mention, on China's effort to build high-speed railroads from Kunming in southern China by 3 potential routes. And if you'd put up that map, I'd appreciate it. I had a 5-year comparative fieldwork project in 8 countries, China plus 7 continental Southeast Asian countries. And what I want to do is essentially describe what China's trying to do, and incidentally, the other 7 partner countries potentially of China, what the vision is, what they're trying to do, and then talk about, has China been able to do it? What have been the effects? What are the good points? What are the bad points of this? But most importantly, what does it tell us about the limits to Chinese power? Chinese power is limited. No American leader would prefer to have China's problems to our own, as bad as we can all read those are. So what I want to do is just take a case study and say what's been happening out here, what can we learn that kind of modulates that really dreary, woe is us kind of security picture that I painted. Now, first thing to say is we attribute, and I even did in my introduction, said I've been working on a project that's kind of part of BRI, Belt and Road Initiative. That's not actually true. Belt and Road Initiative, just I think, put it baldly, was an umbrella that then the Chinese threw all sorts of projects along the way. This project wasn't even the idea of the Chinese. In fact, it came along in 2010. BRI, or One Belt, One Road that became BRI, came out in 2013. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, came out with this vision of connectivity on its own in 2010, 3 years before Xi Jinping was even on the radar screens with this set of issues. So the first thing to say is a lot of the activity we see that China's involved in, China didn't initiate, China responded. So kind of get the idea out that everything that happens in China's region is because of China or a Chinese initiative. Now, of course, China has to be responsive or have a reaction. Now, what I want to do is talk about this network. And the vision that the ASEAN had in 2010, and then that fit in with the BRI, Belt and Road, build infrastructure, connectivity, common development, those kinds of themes, the Chinese reacted to. But the basic vision is, you can see up at the top where all those lines intersect at Kunming in Yunnan province in South China. And basically you will see there are three north-south lines, not perfectly, but basically. The first one is Kunming down to Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City through Phnom Penh, Bangkok, and then down to Singapore. This is a notion, this is a vision, this isn't all reality. It may never all become reality, but it is making incremental progress that's really, in some sense, quite impressive, but there's a long way to go, and who knows what will happen. So what we'll call the eastern route goes from southern China down the coast over to Bangkok through Cambodia and Phnom Penh. The central route is Kunming, and it goes down to Vientiane, capital of Laos, then to Bangkok, down to Singapore. Third line goes Kunming over to Mandalay, Chiang Mai, Rangoon, Bangkok, down to Singapore. Each of those lines is longer than the transcontinental railroad. Now, of course, I'm double counting the Bangkok-Singapore, but we're talking about a massive project, and it's not across the Great Plains of Nebraska level. This is really forbidding terrain, and also forbidding politically in some cases, and in terms of stability as well as terrain. So in any case, you're talking about interconnected network. Now, we think about China taking the initiative, and China really has taken the initiative to get these countries to sign on plans to which they can build, sell the equipment, and so forth. So China's playing a major role. But what is interesting is in the late 1990s, in fact, in the early 1990s, the vice premier at that time, Zhu Rongji, was approached by the Southeast Asians, mainly the Malaysians, asked if China would participate. And China basically says, we're going to build railroads at home before we're going to build them in Southeast Asia. And so basically, it was at least the Malaysians and ASEAN that wanted the Chinese to be more involved, and they had domestic priorities to build out their own particular system. Now, if you ask, what is the Chinese vision? Why do this now? There are a number of reasons, and I'll talk about it, but basically China sees itself, wants to be and sees itself as the economic hub of not only Southeast Asia, but Belt and Road Initiative is a total of 6 economic corridors radiating out from China. So this is just one part of a very much larger vision of connectivity. But we're going to focus on this one. Now, what I wanted to know really is, can China do this? What tools does it use? What reactions does it produce? Does China have limitations? Is China taking risks? Why is it doing all of this? And so rather than talk about growing Chinese power and threat and deterrence and so on, I wanted to see how something actually on the ground is working out and what different interests are embodied as this happens. So, first ambition is make it the economic hub. But China had to have a lot of other reasons than just an abstract desire to have, as one said, in the old days, all roads left, one Chinese said to me, all roads used to lead to Rome. In the future, they're going to lead to Beijing. That was kind of the summary statement here. A second thing that I think the Chinese wanted to do, and I said Zhu Rongji had actually deferred cooperating with the Chinese, with the Southeast Asians, because he wanted to build his own domestic system. And you have to ask, where was China in terms of rail at that particular time? in the year 2000, China had close to 0 kilometers of high-speed rail. And so what we're going to see is that in the space of a decade, China built out an entire domestic, well, not entire, but a very long, and I'll give you the figures on it in a minute. Another thing, motive behind this, beyond building an industry, was that he wanted to, Xi Jinping, when he came along, wanted in a sense legitimate his power by connecting in his periphery and foster economic development. As China's domestic growth was beginning to grow, China wanted to develop periphery markets, export industry. I think Xi Jinping and indeed his predecessors saw this as a kind of equivalent to Boeing. Boeing aircraft drove the American modernization of industry in material sciences, signaling, air traffic controlling. I mean, all of this drove the American industry. And I think the Chinese saw this can drive our industry. And I think that's not a bad vision. And it's certainly, I think, part of what they were trying to do. So there are many reasons. Also, China, as its growth was dropping, had a huge cement industry. It had a huge steel industry. Well, what are you going to do with all those workers and that? And China wanted to build an export industry and build out the infrastructure for the rest of the world. So why we're sort of so skeptical about China in security terms, if you start looking at something real, there are actually a variety of motives. Some probably good ideas in theory and don't work out in practice. Maybe some were bad ideas to begin with. But the point is there's a coherent vision here that is motivating the Chinese, and some of it might well be thought to be positive as well. So where are we right now in building out this vision? What you've got is that central line going from Kunming down to Vientiane through Laos, essentially to the Thai border, opened in December of 21. And so you've now got, both of my colleagues in this project have ridden the railroad. I haven't been back to Laos since it opened. But apparently the traffic, the paying customers are exceeding expectations. And I think thus far the reports on the performance, okay, we got to see how it goes, how it grows. But apparently peasants in mountain areas will pay more for rail tickets and connectivity than people thought. In other words, it's such a forbidding kind of terrain that people are actually willing to pay to be able to move rapidly. And also they've modified the train to carry more freight, and as opposed to passengers and so on. So China's modifying its system to make it more survivable, so to speak. So that's what's actually been built. Now there's another line that China's been working on with the Malaysian called the East Coast Rail Link, and that's a long story, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but it's substantially built but not open yet. There's a little, about 3.5 kilometers that they've built in Thailand, which is the Thais feel obliged to keep the Chinese in the game but don't want to really commit yet. So they've built a little piece to whet the Chinese appetite without completely caving in. So what we've got now is a very small percentage of the line, the total network. But you can see, and China's in negotiations with every element. And there's a kind of logic to negotiation. When one party agrees, then the benefits of connecting in go up. And so, the Laos have a set of problems, but once the Laos agreed to do it and built to the Thai border, the Thais say now, wow, we can get not only to China, but beyond China, because China's building other corridors as well. And so once the Thais do it, then the Malaysians say, well, we don't want to be left out of this, right? And of course, Singapore, in the end, if Singapore says, no, we don't want to hook into this, then they just stop the line here and put the ports here. So you have to look at where in the sequence of negotiation each of these parties comes. But the point is, what is driving this is the perceived self-interest of people, and not just a narrow security view. The security fits in, I'm not denying that, but on the other hand, this is a vision of economic development, urbanization, built on the idea that China cannot be rich and prosperous in a poor area. And most of the research I'm familiar with would suggest that's true. It's easier to be rich with rich neighbors. And China's lowering growth, investing here. Now, there are lots of downsides. This isn't a sales pitch for China's high-speed rail. We'll talk about some of the downsides. But what I'm trying to say is the world's unfolding in a way that isn't just captured by the security analysis that I gave. Now, let me just, in the few minutes that I have left, talk about, if I can get through it, 5 lessons I've learned from this. This is an attempt to speak to what I presume will be the issues that the conference is dealing with throughout its entirety. Lesson 1, don't underestimate the Chinese. I would also say don't overestimate them, and then that leads you to wonder, well, what am I saying? But don't underestimate the Chinese. I think it's an important lesson. And what do I mean by that? In the year 2000, China had virtually no high-speed rail, had no high-speed rail industry that could build electric engines, had no rolling stock industry for high-speed rail cars. They had a quite developed rail industry, but not for high-speed rail. In the year 2000, 0 kilometers basically. I say basically because there was a little experimental line in Guangdong area, but basically none. And in 2021, it has 41,000 kilometers, which means nothing to you, but that's more than the rest of the world combined. And I won't even mention that China, in that same period a little earlier, built an interstate highway system to match. It's got its problems, but built an interstate highway system too. So that we have that. China not only just built that, but in the process built a globally competitive industry. And just for your information, China's making rolling stock in both the Boston area and the Chicago area, becoming very political. Do we buy rolling stock, and do we allow the Chinese into our transportation system? Will they embed chips that make the trains possibly responsive to authorities other than Boston or Chicago? So you can see how the security slops into this. But the point is, China has built a globally competitive industry. This raises an interesting question, and it's very much in the American domestic political issue is, do we need industrial policy here to compete? And what is the nature of that industrial policy? And all I would say is I think that one of the lessons to learn about don't underestimate the Chinese is government can still do some things and focus resources and focus research. And if you look at how China built that industry, it was a Manhattan scale concentration of resources. It also, China went out into the international system and bought intellectual property from the French and the Japanese, and also stole it, but bought a lot, but obtained the rights to duplicate, improve, and build its own brand names. That was all negotiated. China had an amazingly entrepreneurial railroad minister that puts the lie to the fact that government enterprises can't ever accomplish anything with at least efficiency, safety, and without, there was massive corruption. Incident. Man, a little corruption goes a long way. So, and it wasn't so little. So, in any case, don't underestimate China, and this raises the issue of industrial policy. And of course, you'd have to look at what? Trump's Operation Warp Speed, whatever you want to say. That was a concerted public-private partnership to develop a vaccine, which we did and was extremely effective. So it raises this whole question of if China is capable in these ways, what kind of capability do we need to develop? And I don't put this in a strategic, we've got to beat the Chinese and everything. Others would put it in that. But the point is we do need to keep our economy dynamic and competitive, and China is going to put us to the test. And this, it seems to me, is one example. A second lesson is that we seem to see, there's this kind of image of China keeps pushing countries to do things that aren't in their interest. Debt trap diplomacy, and I'm not denying there isn't a certain way in which that makes sense. But on the other hand, you always have these little formative experiences. Somebody walked into a Chinese official was in Washington from Beijing, came by my office, and I asked, and he was sort of responsible for going around and I will say just bureaucratically selling BRI. He was into the propaganda mode, but he said something that was very interesting. He says, this is really a big problem. Xi Jinping's going out all over the world, dropping $50 billion promises here and there. We don't have the talent. We don't have the money. We have needs at home. We got to sort of slow this thing down. And he says, the basic problem is there's more demand from these countries for infrastructure than we can meet. And my first reaction was to be pretty cynical. Until I went and talked to Mahathir, who had been prime minister and once again became prime minister. It's a long story, but he told me he had grown up in Burma and watched the British railways played, and he was always an aficionado pushing rail development, particularly with the Chinese. And he says, the first time I went and talked to the Chinese, they didn't want to build it here, as I said. They want to build their own rail system, and then maybe they'll talk to us. But my point is that everything China's doing in the world doesn't just reflect a master strategy. It also is a reflection of the kinds of demands that the Chinese bureaucracy is getting and the kinds of opportunities they see. Now, I'm not trying to explain everything in that model, but that's a much more kind of I think, rounded explanation for what's happening than the master plan and so forth. There's a responsive character. Third lesson, and I think I'll put it a little more crisply than maybe is warranted, but are we about rhetoric or reality? I sometimes wonder here. Now, what do I mean by that? My team, we spent about 4 years, not continually, but periodic trips for 2-3 weeks at a time, and talked to enterprises, over 150 different organizations in these countries, governments, and so forth. And, what it seems clear to me is that a phrase kept coming up. And I said, well, sir, what's your theory about development, economic development? And the phrase kept coming back, if you want to get rich, build a road. Life operates in a way often on cliches. You got your basic theory and then you adjust it in light of experience. Basic theory is infrastructure and connectivity are essential to development. The Chinese believe that. And frankly, most of the third world countries that I have any experience, they believe that. So the Chinese are not trying to sell something to people, something they don't believe. The issue is, will it be built right? Will we be able to pay the debt burden? Will we be able to do 50,000 things? Will the Chinese use it as a strategic leverage? It doesn't mean they don't have any worries, but they share the objective. Get rich, build a road. So the Chinese, it seems, now you ask, where has the U.S. been in this? and it's a long story, and I'll make it sharper than it deserves. But basically, since probably the Aswan Dam and the period of big projects, the U.S. and the World Bank and others got out of a lot of big infrastructure projects because they often had horrific displacement effects. They had sometimes spread disease from one water basin to the other water basin, ended up not being built right, or were never had sound economics underlying the project. So long and the short of it is, for about 30 years, the U.S. got out of the business of big projects. Now, I'm not saying none anywhere, but that was the trend. We got into the cheaper end of this. We want to improve your governance. We want to have training. And I'm not mocking that. That's important too. But the point is, we got out of the business of providing what people thought they wanted and trying to have an alternative human resource governance approach to development. Well, now, with what China's doing, we're moving back, and if you paid attention to the G20 meeting in New Delhi, they're talking about competing with China's infrastructure in this region by going west from India through the Middle East into Europe. Now, we'll see. The U.S. also in 2018 passed an act called the BUILD Act. We're going to build infrastructure in Asia, and then we appropriated a paltry amount that is not really much to be done. And American firms suffer under disability. They don't have to take orders from the government. It's really big industry in the U.S. that has to decide they want to do something, and the U.S. government, for its part, hasn't been willing to put the kind of massive resources that would be required. So you can think what you want about all of this, but it seems to me that the Chinese have actually spoken to what people want. Now, whether it would be provided in a way that's in their interests or has the result, all to be determined. And China's making a lot of mistakes, which I will get to in a minute as I'm running out of time. So, but in any case, the point is, the Chinese are not just into rhetoric. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Lesson 4. There's this kind of image. I mean, if you just look at it, Kunming's just the smallest part of China, which is off the map. But when you just look at a map and you see big China and then you see these tiny countries, it's not very hard to imagine that the periphery, particularly these mostly not small, but just smaller countries, are sort of putty in the hands. But if you talk to Chinese bureaucrats, as I did, they don't see it as dealing with a bunch of people flat on their back and that they pretty much have to take what they're offered. Just give you some examples. I had one Chinese bureaucrat say, dealing with democracies, this is a real problem because they have elections. They change leaders. They change policies. They change budgets. They don't feel obliged to do what they agreed to when the government changes. They're a problem. Well, I mean, that isn't a rant against democracy. It's just a statement of, that's kind of how they see it. Not so easy to deal with this, right? Just give you another example. Take Duterte. He moves towards China, and then Marcos comes back, and he's providing, I won't say bases, but places with military utility. What do we do about that? Under Duterte, China was talking about infrastructure. I'm not sure where those discussions are now under Marcos. Civil society. Some of these countries, like Myanmar, military regime, but some have impressive levels of democratic and civil society mechanisms. And of course, the Chinese aren't really always very adept, but I would say mostly not adept at dealing with civil society organizations. Just one last example. You go in Thailand. Thailand is a huge, mileage-wise, big piece of the puzzle here. And the Thais basically have had a regime that wants to deal with the Chinese, but it has a rail administration. And the rail administration owns all the land because King Rama, I think it was the second, acquired land for railroads and development early in Thailand's modern history. So the rail administration, in a way, sees itself as a land company and doesn't necessarily want to give the Chinese rights over its land. So it turns out in Thailand, one of the big problems is an existent bureaucracy that sees its interests as somewhat not totally opposed, but very concerned that it keep control over the development rights along the railway and so forth. So what I'm trying to say is these countries are not putty in the hands of Beijing. Now, Laos has a lot less leverage in the situation than Thailand does, but the point is, broadly speaking, the Chinese have to seriously negotiate. I talked to one European ambassador, he says, in Laos, and he says, you won't believe that Laos, even just the small 6.9 million Lao population, they have a million ways to throw sand into the gears. It's the way he put it. And when you talk to the Chinese, it isn't like this has been a piece of cake to negotiate. It's just one thing after the next. Certainly another lesson, and maybe I'll just end on this. I've spent my research life looking at both foreign policy and domestic policy, so it won't be surprising that I come to this conclusion. But domestic politics is important everywhere, and China has domestic politics, and they're not all security-oriented concerns that Chinese people have. And so how this project works out is not just a function of the real estate and processes in Southeast Asia, but it's also a function of a political process in China. You didn't hear me say democratic process, but bureaucratically territorial process in which one interest struggles with the other. Let me just give a few examples of this. First of all, when you start talking about state enterprises in China, you're talking to some considerable extent, not exclusively, about the central government having to decide which bureaucracy gets investment. If we're building railroads, you can be sure the air industry's not. They might like more money, or popular housing. So there are these different functional interests. There are different territories. You decide you want to make Kunming the hub. But Kunming wasn't the only city in China that wanted to be the hub. Off in Guangxi towards the South China Sea, they want to be the hub. Which line do you build first? Who gets the jobs? Who gets the connectivity? China has real politics. And it isn't to say it's democratic, but the idea that everything that happens in China comes out of Xi Jinping's mind, not to my experience, in any case. Now, also intellectuals. You know, we talk a lot about equity and development. Well, there are a lot of people in China that talk about equality in development, or let's say increasing Gini coefficients, more disparity in income, and so on. One professor just a week ago at the Beijing Institute of Technology came out and says, we ought to focus on domestic construction. China suffered huge economic losses from these programs, right? This is a lowly professor that's standing up the regime, and there's lots of that kind of pushback. So let me just end by a couple of conclusions. China's international behavior isn't driven simply by some master strategy and a rhetorical policy. It's driven by a political process that produces uncertain outcomes, sometimes the implementers of the policy do a good job in China. Sometimes, like the people that built the Hanoi rail system, had never built a railroad outside of China before, and it was a fiasco that convinced the Vietnamese we don't want to do business with the Chinese. So the first thing to say is that how this and so much else in China evolves has to do with who's in the game, who has what resources, with what kind of experience, as well as the reaction of the partners. And this is a much more, I think, productive way to think about dealing with China. You have to deal with real things, and it has to meet the needs of potential partners, not just a strategic design. Well, I think I've talked enough. I probably inflamed half the audience. But in any case, I welcome your questions.
Thank you. That was really stimulating. And I have some questions, but I'm gonna defer to the audience. I think we're using these two mics on either side, so we're not going to pass around a mic. So if you have a question, if you don't mind standing up and going to the mic. Thank you. Okay.
Oh, here comes a tough one.
This is actually a softball one. You went to a lot of different countries and you spoke to a lot of different people with a lot of different political views, both domestically as well as vis-a-vis China. So can you give us a little land map of how that went? Who was receptive to your questions and why? And was it politically motivated? Not at all? Or and how? Did you get everything you wanted or not?
Well, there are a lot of ways to cut into that. Let me just say, first of all, big picture. I'm a great believer in luck in life. And luck was with this project. There were 8 countries. I had a pretty good, I'll say, bureaucratic Rolodex on China and virtually no Rolodex on these 7 countries. I'd met a few people along the way. I don't mean it was zero, but my China contacts and bureaucratic contacts were much better than, and I don't mean that's the only reason I got colleagues, because there's a lot in studying different countries about culture, economic systems, administration, and so on. So this was a genuine equal partnership of us 3. It was not a one-man show by any means. But in any case, just apropos of luck, we decided to start in China. And this was in about 2015. Well, if you've been watching the, let's say, access of field research in China from 2015 to now, and documental, archival research and so on, 2015 on has been a gradual, and maybe not so gradual, restriction of access, particularly to political scientists and field researchers, and people in contemporary archives as well. So we were lucky. We just picked up the China part first and got all of the essential interviewing done there. We could have just as easily started, it's an interesting question, if we hadn't started in China, where should we have started? I would say probably maybe Thailand we might have started, because Thailand had the biggest interest besides the Chinese. They want to make Bangkok the Chicago of Thailand, basically. East-west, north-south, commercial, shipping, Great Lakes. Bangkok is that kind of, if you just look at, well, the map that's no longer there, Bangkok is sort of in the center, right? Sort of like Chicago is, not exactly, but.
Is Chicago Thailand or Chicago Southeast Asia?
Well, actually both, Southeast Asia. Yeah, so it's in the middle of that map. So anyway, luck plays a role. We started in China. And if we hadn't started in China, I don't think we would have had the access. If we'd started in 2020 there, I think we'd have had a lot of problems. Now, did we have cooperation? I think you implied, did they tell us the truth? Of course, there are 8 countries and different situations. Burma, we had the least to talk to. But so much is ironic. I bring in Indonesia because it actually, the Chinese are building a high-speed rail there. So we did add Indonesia just as a sideline. It turns out they, at that moment, had a Christian mayor, or a governor, they call him. Ahok. His name was Ahok. Anyway, I just happened to sit by him in a luncheon, and for an hour and a half, he had nobody else to talk to but me. So I had a ton of questions about the railroad, and he just spilled out and says, I don't think it's such a great idea, but our president does, and he's in a strategic game with the Chinese, and so, I'm not bucking that trend, was basically. So often people were truthful to the point where I wondered if it was in their interest to be truthful, because I was there explicitly to write a book. And so sometimes you have to be, it seems to me, mindful of the sensitivities and you don't want to put your informants in a problem. But I'm often, we tend to be sometimes more regarding of what we presume their problems are than they are. So I'm not drawing any macro conclusion, but I would say overall, people like to talk about what they're interested in. And a lot of my field research has been with infrastructure because it's technical, it's political, but it masquerades as an engineering question or a finance question. You don't have to immediately packages. I'm interested in what makes Chinese fight with each other, right? Sensitive question. But what are the problems you face in building something that's important? So basically, we had an extraordinarily good, and Mahathir, he said, when I grew up as a boy, it was under British colonial rule. They built railroads, and I saw how it changed. When I became a leader, that's kind of what my theory is, that transportation connectivity is essential to urbanization. If you want one, you got to get the other. So I was very pleased with the access we had. Now, like I said, I got no useful information really in Myanmar. That was just, except by looking at the situation. If you go to Naypyidaw, the capital, is a really eye-opening experience, even if no one will talk to you, which they probably won't. So, I don't know, that was a wandering question, Jan, to which I gave a wandering answer. Oh, Cambodia. This gets to one other thing on that with the United States. Both in Cambodia and predictably in Myanmar, but also in Vietnam, these are countries that, and Indonesia, that have had sanctions placed on them by the United States of various degrees to various targets. But basically, both in Cambodia and Vietnam, this theme came up repeatedly. We would like to do more things with you Americans on infrastructure and so on, but A, you have no money, and B, you put sanctions on us. You decry that we are becoming aligned with China, but you leave us no alternative. Now, I know all of the arguments, and I'm not saying, but that's how these people look at it. You want us not to be dependent. You want us to not get into debt trap diplomacy, but what, do you want us to stay poor? Is that the implication? So I think we need to rethink our foreign policy toolbox. And we need to get better at, we need to fix our own economy, and we need to, I think, use economic instruments. And by that I don't mean negative inducements exclusively, I mean positive economic carrots.
Okay, we have another question here. And if you have a question, just go up to one of the mics, and then we'll go around that way. So, London?
Yeah, so I want to build on the last comment you make. Like, we need to fix the, our own economy. So I want to ask you. I know you do research.
The American economy.
Yeah, you do research about infrastructure, right? But then you talk about how the competition with China has prompted the U.S. to take actions to respond to those, right? Like, for example, you mentioned about the government works, right? The state enterprise work. So I want to know that beyond the infrastructure, are you also seeing other areas of American domestic policies that have changed in response to the competition from China? And as we know that the withdrawal of government in this country is widespread, right? It's kind of the widespread withdrawal and dismantling of public institutions. So have you seen any other area like social policies or those areas where that the competition with China can help produce sensible domestic policies?
Well, one thing is, I'm not sure that I'm going to speak to all of the implications of what you said, but the first thing that's happened, it seems to me, is that we've increased, one of our responses to competition with China has been to increase export controls, control over the flow of technology, which is beginning to, I don't know, Mary, you've been, I think, concerned with this issue of export controls and knowledge transfer coming out of the university setting, right? And it would be fair to say that boards of trustees and university administrations, and given the role DOD, among others, play in funding valued programs, that we're coming under more and more constraint. Also, there's the protection of students and personnel that might go to China, and what is their risk, in terms of approving dissertation research topics and so on. So I think the whole area of knowledge transfer, technology transfer has been, to my way of thinking, I'm not saying we shouldn't have any guardrails. I'm not saying that, I don't believe that. But I think generally the danger is making them too broad. And also there has to be another condition, it seems to me. We have to be almost the sole source of the technology in question. Because you can be assured if an American firm doesn't sell it, a German or British or just, I'm not picking on any particular country, but they're all in economic competition. And all you're doing by putting up export controls that somebody else will violate is denying your own workers the business and the firms and so on. So to me, given I started my career in the academic exchange and building on, I was at the Academy of Sciences. At the time I was there, we had a report, or just a little before I went there, in 1982, it was called the Corson Report. And the Corson Report was basically what should be our policy on transfer of technology, directly, indirectly, period, to the Soviet Union. And that report came out with essentially what I think is appropriate now is you need high fences on a real small yard, not low fences on vast territory. It's very hard actually to operationalize what all that means. But we went through that with the Soviet Union, and we're now going that direction with China. And I think it makes us less competitive economically. I think our only strategy, to me, now this is an opinion, my view is Maginot lines and walls don't work very well for the long run. And so what we have to do is take our national advantage of our comparative advantage is innovation. Well, that ought to be reflected in immigration policy. Lots of skill out there, a lot of potential productivity in the world that wants to come here. We ought to find a way to do it. So I think that whole zone of intellectual competition, and I have no problem with that. It's military competition that becomes, if they're not in balance. So that's the zone I'm most worried about. But I don't know if that speaks to your question. Oh.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Juan Cole. Been connected with the Middle East and South Asia centers here. Your presentation reminded me of the one recent instance of an American BRI, which is that President Biden announced this odd plan to bring things from Mumbai to to Saudi Arabia and then to build a high-speed rail link through Saudi Arabia up to Haifa in Israel, and then a shipping link on to Greece.
Right.
I have to admit that I'm more of a cultural and intellectual historian and not don't have your expertise in the infrastructure side, but this it made no sense whatsoever to me economically. My understanding is that shipping goods costs about a fifth of what sending them by rail does, so I don't understand why Mumbai through the Suez Canal to Greece wouldn't be cheaper. It seemed to me mostly political, that the ideal of the United States now is to have a counter BRI, so you have India and Japan and Australia with the U.S. as a kind of quartet that are imagining, so far I think mostly imagining, alternative routes to counter China. But this seems to me to be the only concrete suggestion that's come out of all that thinking. And I don't understand why it seems plausible to anybody. The things that you're talking about, I mean, my guess is that shipping some things from Shanghai to Ho Chi Minh City would also be cheaper than sending them by rail.
Right.
But there are lots of inland cities on your map that wouldn't benefit from that. But there's nothing in the middle of Saudi Arabia, so why send goods from India that way?
Right. Well, first of all, don't ask me to defend that policy initiative. It sounds to me that possibly you spent more time thinking about it than coming out of this was G20 meeting in Delhi. I don't want to leave it at that kind of facetious answer, but I wouldn't overestimate the amount of thought that went into this. I mean, just as a, would you have a different instinct, Ken? No. Okay. So the premise that this was really thought about, I'm not sure. Secondly, if you ask the question, which I said, are we willing? Everyone wants to build a road, but who's willing to pay for the road? And I mean, if you can't decide to fund Ukraine in its exigency, I don't know how you're going to fund, or at least the U.S. taxpayer is going to understand all the questions you just asked, right? So.
I think you do have to put it in the context. The U.S. is trying very hard now to link together Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Right.
And I think the Saudis are going to put up a lot of the money for this
Yeah.
if it happens. And it's to turn the Saudis more toward
Right.
U.S. friends and less toward China. So that,
Right.
So
I
in that
under-
strategic
thank you
context.
for the-
I agree with you with the degree of
Yeah.
thought that's gone into it, though.
Yeah, there is a political logic of the moment, given what Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United States. But that's not the same as an economic logic. And so, building a big expensive project that doesn't have a solid economic rationale might not ultimately improve relations among these countries, right? So, but let me give a little bit more serious. First of all, in my book, I don't mean to talk about it, but at the very end conclusion, I said the U.S. ought to have a concept of what I would call balanced connectivity. Remember I said the Chinese informant that said, used to be all roads led to Rome, well, now they're going to go to Beijing. Well, if all of this dynamic, economic, rapidly growing area is totally focused on China, I don't think that's so healthy geoeconomically for this region. We are missing a lot of growth opportunities if we're not involved. So it isn't just an anti-China strategy. But basically, I said we ought to be talking about east-west connectivity and going from India across, well, if Myanmar ever gets on a stable, positive direction. But anyway, across from India, Myanmar, through Thailand, off, and this is a very, especially the Bangkok area and so on, so that we ought to think about helping build infrastructure that diversifies connectivity and creates strategic opportunities for us. So in that sense, I kind of like that idea that we just depreciated. But I like the idea of the U.S. getting into the game. Now, that doesn't strike me as the place to get in the game, but, you know, it would take a lot more study than just me reacting to the question. So, but I do think the idea of having a kind of strategic, geostrategic, economic idea that you don't just build infrastructure anywhere, you build it where it's going to balance connectivity and dependencies so that you're just not contributing to China's total leverage in this situation. I think that's a sensible policy. I mean, in theory, now where the real opportunities are, I don't know. So in that sense, but I get back to it, the problem with the idea you put forth or the one I just put forth is are Americans going to pay for that? And, you know, there's a lot to be said for the answer is no. Look, as good as the infrastructure repair underway is, we still need to do a lot of infrastructure, high-speed rail. Why build it in Myanmar when we need it between San Francisco and LA? So there are lots of questions here. But I think we need to participate in the world in a way that the world recognizes they have the need. But I don't know, is that responsive?
I think we have time for one last question, and Martin, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Martin Chorzempa, Peterson Institute. Thank you for the talk, and also thank you for many decades of your work. I actually, what was mentioned earlier, the book that you co-authored with Ken over here, was the first thing I read about Chinese bureaucratic politics in China. And one of the things I think that stuck out from that book is you pointed out that there was increasing pluralism in China, increasing pressures on the regime to open up. But I think what we've seen since then is it's unfortunately seemed to go very much the other direction.
Right.
And so I'm in Washington, usually trying to hold the center ground and the moderate. But the problem is that if you look at Chinese politics from a U.S. perspective, pretty much everything you see over the last 10 plus years has been very dark. It's been eliminating the pluralism, less checks on party power, less potential ability for someone else to push against what Xi Jinping wants to do, let's say, in relation to Taiwan. One of the things you mentioned in your talk today is that you think there's a real chance of kinetic conflict between the two. And I guess what I would ask you is, one, how would you update, just briefly how Chinese politics has shifted under Xi Jinping since you wrote your book? And secondly, what should the United States really be doing about it? If we really think, like you say, that there's a good chance of war, then that leads to a very different set of securitized objectives making a lot more sense than we might like, or at least that I might like as an economist, but would kind of go against the advice you were saying on being careful on export controls on the other. So I'm curious what you think about that. Thanks.
Well, just taking off your last point, I think there are going to be contradictions in almost any policy we can imagine, that there isn't the perfect solution and we're just not quite smart enough to figure it out. So I'm not in the search for a perfect solution. I wouldn't object to one, but I don't think there is one, partly because of the radically different interests there and perceptions. But the way I'd frame it is, what do we need to do to make this a manageable situation? Our first responsibility to avoid 2 nuclear wars in direct kinetic conflict. That's got to be our primary goal. So how do we manage this? Not with the certainty we can achieve it, because I don't think there's certainty, but certainly increase the odds, putting our hands on the scale of moderation in both places. And let me just put it out there. I realize that I don't know how debatable it is. Different people would see it differently. But I think we have kind of moved from a nebulous one China policy, and we could talk about what that was, to a one China, one Taiwan policy. I think if we haven't gone the whole distance, we're well down that road, and it's happening. And I don't think that that's an acceptable long-term stable situation with the Chinese. Now, the implication is then we have to keep a certain amount of ambiguity. We have to, on the one hand, deter Taiwan from doing anything that would trigger conflict that would draw us in. But we also have to deter China from using force to resolve the issue. And our president has, by 4 occasions now, is that the count, recommitted. It's really his policy would be to intervene if Taiwan was attacked. Now that leaves open what does intervene mean, in what dimensions. Lots of things probably couldn't even be decided until you know what has happened and who's in charge in both societies and so forth. So it's unanswerable. But I think we have to stop backtracking from the basic agreement that kept 40 years of peace in the Taiwan Straits. And it wasn't so long ago, with Ma Ying-jeou until 2016, that actually things were evolving in you could at least be optimistic that war avoidance was maybe even likely. And Washington has changed. Xi Jinping has changed. Yeah, one hand can't clap if the Chinese don't cooperate. But the point is the Chinese see us moving towards something or already there, but they're afraid to say it. Because if they say it, then they've got to act on that. So I think we've got to be more sensitive on Taiwan. And I know all of the vulnerabilities that brings on somebody who says, well, yes, Taiwan's a democracy. No one wants to hear but. But there is a but in the sentence. And so I think that's the first thing we have to do. But then you ask in our system, where are the incentives? We have defined global politics now as a struggle between authoritarianism and democracy. If you define it that way, and then you put Taiwan into the equation, you're pretty much left with a policy. I mean, a reaction. So that to me is sort of the core of it. Second thing is that this democracy autocracy. Look, I like democracy just as much as anybody. But if you frame it that way, and then you have a committee of Congress that's a standing committee to look at the Chinese Communist Party, if you're in China, sort of has the U.S. slid into a regime change frame of mind? Is that the stable equilibrium the U.S. is looking for? If it is, you're not going to get any cooperation from the Chinese Communist Party. I'm sad to say. So I think we've got to modulate what we're saying about ideology, and of course going into election, what are the odds of that? 0. So that's why I'm extremely worried, because I think the two neuralgic things, both things Nixon dealt with. Taiwan kicked the can way down the road with a diffuse formula. And we're about our nation's interests, not ideology. Now, I know there must be at least half the room that doesn't agree with the implications of that, but that's just what I think. Is that at least responsive to your question?
Thank you for this.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for this great talk. I want to congratulate you for covering a lot of ground, and we have a small gift for you, which I'm
Chinese. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.